Sane Occultism by Dion Fortune. Narrated by Matthew Schmitz. 13. Occultism and Immorality. We now come to the consideration of another and very important aspect, the occult aspect of sex. I have dealt with this in my book, The Esoteric Philosophy of Love and Marriage, but I have touched but lightly on the black aspect of the subject in those pages. A brief explanation of the basic ideas is necessary for those unacquainted with this book. Those who have entered into the deeper aspects of occultism know that Kundalini, the serpent force which lies curled up at the base of the spine, is really the sex force which has its center in the sacral plexus, from which issue the nerves which govern the reproductive organs. In the normal way, this force is fully absorbed in its physiological functions, but there are two ways of rendering it available for other purposes. For in its psychic aspect, it is a very important potency on the inner planes. It can be sublimated above its natural plane of expression, as is done by the ascetic, or it can be degraded below it. The latter is the method employed by the black occultist. We must, however, distinguish between the person who is merely making occultism a cloak for his vices and the person who, with knowledge, is deliberately using this great force as an occult battery. It is not easy to give sufficient information on this subject to forewarn the innocent without supplying the evil-minded with information they would be better without. Let us try and understand the principles which govern the right use of this force, and then the methods of its abuse will become clear. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. When the whole nature is concentrated upon spiritual things, it takes little interest in the things of the senses. The great driving forces of the emotional nature are then turned to spiritual objects instead of earthly ones. This is the only true sublimation. From such a concentration of the whole nature on an ideal comes tremendous psychic energy. The black occultist desires to obtain this concentration of psychic energy without foregoing the sensory gratifications. He wants, in fact, to eat his cake and have it. How is he to manage this? By the simple expedient of eating his own cake and then borrowing somebody else's. We then have the spectacle of one person, his stomach full of cake and another slice in his hand, confronting another person who has had just enough cake to whet his appetite and is very hungry. The enterprising cake stealer then proceeds to trade in the superfluous slice of cake with other hungry cake eaters. A variation of the metaphor may give a better understanding. The Japanese employ tame cormorants for fishing. The birds have a ring round their long necks which prevents them from swallowing the fish they catch, which are transferred from their pouches to that of the fishermen. The cormorants, needless to say, are kept hungry in order to encourage them to catch fish. The occultist, who works with sex, always has his cage of human-ringed cormorants. The poor creatures do not wear very well and have to be constantly replaced. I will describe the methods of some of these fishers of souls at present in our midst, and I have no doubt that many of my readers will recognize familiar faces. For the first I will describe, I have a certain amount of respect, for I think he is sincere according to his lights, though I am of the opinion that his lights are a squint. He advocates the pagan view of life and a return to the primitive, and tells unmarried ladies of uncertain age that what they need is more of his male magnetism, and proceeds to administer it in the time-honored fashion, with results that can better be imagined than described. He is probably quite right in his diagnosis that for the full flowering of their natures, they need the experiences of love and marriage, but these are not to be obtained in the hole-and-corner fashion in which he gives them. There is a great deal more in sex than the aspect we share with the rest of the vertebrates. The magnetic rapport of marriage is on the emotional, not the physical plane. The occult aspect of sex is its sacramental aspect, not its animal aspect. This disciple of Dionysus is atavistic. He is a throwback to an earlier subrace. His spiritual home is in the groves of Ashtoreth. His way may be the way of the servant, but it is certainly not the way of the Christ. Another group of occultists who have attracted some attention and deserve more seem to be constructing a reservoir of astral force to be used for magical purposes. This reservoir appears to be supplied by inducing women to concentrate their emotions on the leader of the group by telling them that they have a link with him in their past lives. The well-known psychic who has been giving this advice even goes so far as to tell some of his victims that he can read their future and that they will eventually marry the person upon whom they are instructed to concentrate. The effect of this advice on unmarried girls is bad enough, but it is a still more serious matter when it is given to married women, especially when they are also told that if they want to advance rapidly on the path, they should not live with their husbands, but allow themselves to be put in touch with an astral lover. Not only does this precious advice break up homes, but in several cases, to my personal knowledge, it has rendered the recipients mentally unbalanced. To this unsavory counsel, an attractive bait is usually added. The clairvoyant declares that their psychic centers are just on the verge of opening, and that a very little would render them clairvoyant. If this information is well received, he goes further and says that they are already in touch with their master on the inner planes, that they are actively engaged in occult work at night when out of the body, and that it is only because they fail to bring through the memory that they are unaware of it. This is a bait that few can resist, and they pay visit after visit to learn how their auras are getting on and what they have been doing recently on the inner planes. Occult knowledge may never be sold for money, and no initiate who is under the Great White Lodge will ever charge a fee for any form of occult work. This is such a well-known esoteric fact that it is a little difficult to sympathize with those who choose to part with half-guineas for information concerning their progress on the path, it being so obvious that the man who will ask and accept the half-guinea cannot be on the path himself. Another aspect of the work of this same group has been repeatedly exposed in the newspapers, notably in Truth, whose reputation for integrity in these matters stands high. As much of the details as could be printed in the English press were published by that journal. Fuller reports are available in the pages of an American magazine, the O.E. Library Critic. Recently, the Continental Police, who are not squeamish, stepped in, and one of the persons concerned got 6 months' imprisonment, so it can be judged how serious and how widespread are these abuses. Briefly, the charges against these men concern the practice of that form of unnatural vice known as homosexuality, the offense for which Oscar Wilde received a sentence of imprisonment. It is a very cruel form of vice, as the victims are usually boys and youths on the threshold of life. It is also very infectious, spreading an ever-widening circle as those who have become habituated to it in their turn proselytize for victims. Those against whom the charges are brought have never answered them, but leave the country each time there is a fresh outcry, returning when it has blown over. As it is the policy of the English police not to press the charges if the persons concerned are willing to leave the country, many people believe the rumors to be groundless, but the action of the Dutch police in securing a conviction proves that they are not. The many supporters of these people defend them by asking how it can be that men of such dedicated lives, who give such lofty and beautiful teaching, can be addicted to such foul practices. For those who have made a serious study of occultism, the explanation is self-evident. It was this particular vice which was one of the chief causes of the decadence of the Greek mysteries. As explained on a previous page, one of the objects of the occultist of the left-hand path is to render available and conserve on the inner planes the energy generated by sex force without having to practice self-control and sublimation. Normally, the life force is brought down from its divine source through the positive male vehicle and returned back to the source of all life through the negative female vehicle, thus completing the circuit. If, however, there can be no vehicle of the opposite magnetism to form the returning arc, that force is either earthed and diffused, or, if there be the necessary occult knowledge, it is conserved for magical purposes. It is the latter end which is pursued by the individuals we have referred to who inculcate unnatural vice as a means of producing psychic development, which it unquestionably does. With that psychic development, however, goes an irritability of the nervous system, which shows itself in excessive sensitiveness and violent outbursts of temper, thus clearly revealing the pathological nature of such development and what poles asunder it is from the trained psychism of the true initiate, who, above all else, shows by his health and serenity the soundness of the system on which he works. We may finally notice that form of black occultism, less common in England than the others already considered, in which cruelty and blood sacrifice play a part. Any strong emotion is a source of astral energy, and fear and pain are no exceptions to the rule. Moreover, blood, being a vital fluid, contains a large proportion of ectoplasm, or etheric substance. When shed, this ectoplasm rapidly separates from the congealing blood and thus becomes available for materializations. It is for this reason that blood sacrifices are offered to deities of a certain type of primitive peoples. Only the lowest types of entities will use the etheric emanations of blood for their manifestations. Higher types use the ethers which are set free when volatile substances are burnt, hence the use of incense in magical work. The evocation of these lower forms of life is a very dangerous undertaking and can only be performed by a very advanced occultist. To evoke such beings for experimental purposes is not legitimate, for in order to materialize, they draw a portion of etheric substance from each person taking part in the ceremonial. Even when the magic circle be used for protection, some etheric emanation, at least, has to be extruded across it if full manifestation with function is to take place. And although the entity may be forced to disgorge before being given the license to depart, the ectoplasm it has used comes back to its owner horribly contaminated. The only circumstances, in my opinion, under which such an evocation is justifiable is when an exorcism is being performed in order to free a person from the domination of such an entity, and magic has to be called in to undo what magic has already done.